It happens fast, and it happens at night. Flames climb the cedar roof beams of the greatest palace complex on Earth, and within hours, columns that took decades to raise and gild are standing as blackened skeletons against the sky. This is not a city under siege. There is no battle raging outside its gates. The man who controls this city already controls it completely. And yet, on this night, he lets it burn. Or perhaps he starts the fire himself. Even the people who were there could not agree on which. Some ancient writers describe a calculated act of vengeance. Others describe a drunken party that spiraled out of control. What seems clear is that by morning, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, the city built to make Persian power look eternal, was gone. To understand how something this deliberate or this careless could happen, we have to go back more than 150 years to the moment this city was born, and to the system that built it, celebrated in it, and ultimately could not save it. Persepolis did not begin as Persia's capital in the way we usually think of capitals. The Achaemenid Empire was founded by Cyrus the Great in the mid-6th century BCE, but it was his successor, Darius the First, who around 518 BCE chose a windswept stone terrace at the foot of a mountain in the region of Persis in what is now southern Iran, and decided to build something unlike anything the empire had constructed before. Darius did not need Persepolis for administration. The empire already governed through cities like Susa, Babylon, and Ecbatana, where kings and officials handled the actual business of running a territory that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River. Persepolis was built for something else. It was built to be seen. That distinction matters more than it might first appear. Persepolis functioned primarily as a ceremonial capital, a stage for royal ritual, and above all, a setting for the celebration of Nowruz, the Persian New Year, when representatives from across the empire were said to gather and present themselves before the king. The buildings reflect this purpose. The Apadana, the great audience hall, could reportedly hold thousands of people beneath columns rising over 20 meters high. The Gate of All Nations welcomed visitors with monumental stone guardians, and carved into the staircases of the Apadana are some of the most studied reliefs in the ancient world, long processions of delegates from roughly 23 subject peoples, each identified by distinct clothing, hairstyles, and the goods they carry, moving in orderly lines toward the throne. For a long time, popular retellings described these processions simply as tribute, as conquered peoples forced to hand over wealth to their masters. Modern historians are more careful. The evidence suggests these scenes may represent something closer to structured gift-giving tied to Nowruz, a display of the empire's diversity functioning almost like a piece of political theater. Whether every visitor felt genuine loyalty or simply performed, it is impossible to know. But the message carved into that stone was intentional either way, an empire built not on erasing different peoples, but on displaying them, all bound to a single center. That center depended on a system built for scale. To govern territory this vast, the Achaemenids divided their empire into provinces called satrapies, each overseen by a satrap who answered to the king, but often held enormous local authority. Communication across such distances could have been a fatal weakness, so the empire built the Royal Road, a network stretching roughly from Sardis in the west to Susa in the east, supported by a relay system of mounted messengers who could move royal orders across the empire in a fraction of the time an ordinary traveler would need. The empire minted a standardized gold coin, the Daric, to stabilize trade and payment across different regions, and used Aramaic as a shared administrative language, allowing officials in wildly different cultures to communicate without forcing everyone to adopt Persian customs. This was, by the standards of the ancient world, a remarkably sophisticated system. It allowed the Achaemenids to rule over Egyptians, Babylonians, Lydians, Bactrians, and dozens of other peoples without demanding uniformity. But the strength of this system also contained its long-term vulnerability. Persepolis could stand as a symbol of unity precisely because real power was distributed outward, resting heavily on the loyalty of satraps and the personal authority of the king. And personal authority, unlike a stone terrace, is not permanent. It has to be defended, reinforced, and occasionally proven in battle. When it could not be proven, the entire structure was exposed. That exposure began to show earlier than many people realize. Darius's campaign into Greece ended in defeat at Marathon in 490 BCE. His son Xerxes followed with a massive invasion a decade later, achieving early victories, but ultimately suffering catastrophic losses at Salamis and eventually Plataea. Neither defeat destroyed the empire. Persia remained enormously wealthy and controlled its core territories for another century and a half. But these setbacks mattered in a system where royal legitimacy was tied to the appearance of invincibility. Over the following decades, the empire also experienced internal revolts, including uprisings among Western satraps in the mid-4th century BCE, along with repeated succession crises inside the royal family itself. None of these problems alone threatened to end the empire, but they revealed a pattern. A system that looked unshakable from the outside was quietly absorbing damage from within. By the time Darius the Third took the throne in 336 BCE, he inherited an empire that was still vast, still wealthy, and still commanded enormous armies, but one whose legitimacy had been strained by decades of internal conflict. He also inherited a new and unexpected threat from the west. 2 years later, in the spring of 334 BCE, a young Macedonian king named Alexander crossed into Asia Minor, and what followed was not a single dramatic battle, but a chain of escalating confrontations that exposed just how differently these two military systems operated. The Granicus River in 334 BCE, Alexander's forces defeated a Persian army built around heavy cavalry and regional levies. At Issus in 333 BCE, Darius himself commanded the Persian forces and was decisively beaten, reportedly abandoning his camp, his family, and eventually the battlefield as his lines collapsed. This mattered enormously because in the Achaemenid system, the king's presence on the field was not just tactical, it was symbolic. A king who fled undermined the very authority the entire structure was built around. Then, at Gaugamela in 331 BCE, despite commanding a much larger force on ground Darius himself had chosen, the Persian army was broken again, and this time, the defeat was final. Darius fled east. He would never again command an army capable of stopping Alexander. What followed was not the destruction of the empire, but its steady dismantling. Babylon surrendered without a fight, its governor choosing to preserve the city rather than resist. Susa, one of the empire's key administrative capitals, followed the same path. This is where the story becomes less about a single military campaign, and more about what each city represented. Babylon and Susa were centers of governance, and their leaders made a practical calculation: better to negotiate favorable terms than to be destroyed. Persepolis was different. It was not simply another administrative city to be managed. It was the ceremonial soul of Achaemenid identity, and marching toward it meant marching toward the empire's self-image, not just its infrastructure. The road there was not undefended. In the winter of 330 BCE, a Persian commander named Ariobarzanes positioned a smaller force at a narrow mountain pass known as the Persian Gates, along the route connecting Susa to Persepolis. For a time, this defense held. The terrain favored the defenders, and Alexander's initial assault was repelled. But holding a single pass could not compensate for the deeper structural problem plaguing Persian resistance at this stage of the war. There was no coordinated, strategic reserve left to reinforce it, no second army waiting to exploit the delay. According to ancient accounts, Alexander's forces eventually found or were guided along an alternate route, allowing them to outflank the defenders. The pass fell. The road to Persepolis was open. When Alexander entered the city, he took control of a treasury ancient sources describe as staggering, though the exact figures reported by different writers vary widely and are likely exaggerated in places. What is not disputed is the scale of wealth involved. wealth accumulated over nearly 2 centuries of imperial administration. For several months, Alexander occupied Persepolis without destroying it. And then, sometime around the spring of 330 BCE, the fire happened. Here's where the story fractures, because the ancient sources themselves disagree, and the disagreement tells us something important about how uncertain even contemporaries were about Alexander's true intentions. The explanation favored by many modern historians is that the burning of Persepolis was a deliberate, calculated act, timed to send an unmistakable political message. Alexander had positioned himself, at least publicly, as an avenger of Greece, retaliating for Xerxes' destruction of Athenian temples during the invasion of 480 BCE. Burning the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid kings would symbolically close that chapter and announce to Persians and Greeks alike that the old order was finished. This interpretation is supported by archaeological evidence showing that the destruction was not uniform across the entire site. Certain structures, including the Apadana and areas connected to Xerxes' palace, show heavier burning, while other buildings were left comparatively intact, a pattern more consistent with a targeted act than a chaotic, all-consuming blaze. But there is another version, preserved by later writers like Diodorus, Plutarch, and Curtius Rufus, and it is far less calculated. In this account, the fire begins during a celebration, fueled by wine, where a companion of Alexander's, a woman named Thais, is said to have urged the gathering to set the palace alight as revenge for what Xerxes had done to Athens generations earlier. In this telling, Alexander himself joins in, and the fire spreads with the impulsive energy of a party that has gotten out of hand rather than the precision of a planned demolition. Modern historians debate how much of this account reflects an actual event versus a dramatic embellishment added by later writers who enjoyed a good story. Some ancient sources even suggest Alexander later regretted what happened and ordered the fire extinguished once it had already spread beyond control. Whether every detail of either account is exact may be less important than what both versions agree on. Deliberate or impulsive, calculated or chaotic, the outcome carried the same meaning. The empire's ceremonial center, the physical symbol of 2 centuries of Achaemenid identity, was gone, and in a system where legitimacy had always depended as much on image and ritual as on armies and taxation, destroying that image was its own kind of victory, whether or not Alexander had planned it that way from the start. The burning of Persepolis did not by itself end the Achaemenid Empire. Darius the Third was still alive, having fled east with a shrinking group of loyalists, but the symbolic collapse the fire represented was quickly followed by a very real one. Later that year, Darius was killed not by Alexander's army, but by his own satrap, Bessus, who hoped to seize what remained of Persian authority for himself. It was a fitting, almost tragic, final failure of the very system that had built Persepolis in the first place. A structure of power that depended so heavily on personal loyalty to the king that when the king was weak enough, that loyalty simply evaporated. The empire that had once bound together dozens of peoples through shared ritual, shared roads, and shared administration finished not in one battle, but in betrayal from within its own ranks. What remained of Persepolis after that night was, for centuries, largely forgotten by the outside world, its ruins slowly buried under windblown soil in the shadow of the mountain that once framed its skyline. It would not be until the 20th century, particularly through excavations led by researchers, including Ernst Herzfeld and Erich Schmidt in the 1930s, that the site was properly uncovered and studied. What they found confirmed much of what ancient writers had described: layers of ash and charring, consistent with a major fire, concentrated in specific areas, rather than spread evenly across the entire complex. In an unexpected twist, the very fire that destroyed Persepolis also helped preserve parts of it, sealing certain rooms, tablets, and foundations under ash and collapsed material for over 2,000 years, protecting them from later looting and weathering in ways an intact, actively used site might not have survived. Today, Persepolis stands as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of archaeology's richest windows into how the ancient world's largest empire actually functioned. The reliefs still show those long processions of delegates, still readable after more than 2 millennia. What the site reveals is not simply a story of golden columns and eventual destruction, but a case study in how empires hold together and how they come apart. Persepolis was never the seat of everyday governance. That job belonged to other cities. Its true function was to project unity, to make an enormously diverse empire look and perhaps feel like a single coherent system. That system was genuinely sophisticated for its era, built on shared infrastructure, shared currency, and a surprising degree of cultural tolerance. But it was also a system whose center of gravity rested on personal loyalty and symbolic legitimacy rather than durable, self-sustaining institutions. When that legitimacy cracked on the battlefield at Gaugamela and in the flight of a king who could not hold his own lines, the empire's ceremonial heart became not a fortress, but a target. The fire that took Persepolis did not create that weakness. It simply revealed it in the most visible way possible. That is the pattern worth remembering here. Not simply that a beautiful city burned, but that its burning exposed something true about how it had always worked. A system built to look eternal turned out to depend on far more fragile foundations than the stone it was carved from. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this look at how Persepolis rose, functioned, and ultimately fell, consider liking the video and subscribing for more deep dives into the systems behind history's great empires. And I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Do you believe the burning of Persepolis was a calculated political message, or a moment of celebration that spiraled out of control? Let me know in the comments.